Hi, everybody. I hope it's decent with a taste of spring ahead where you are. I'm Jim Strick of the Board of Directors of the Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust, and I'm going to introduce today's talk and our speaker. First, I want to give you a heads up that our next Zoom event online, mark your calendars, is going to be 3 weeks from today, Saturday, the 27th of March. Professor Jorge Barraza, a professor of political science in Mexico City, will be presenting on the mass psychology of fascism at that seminar. So watch for the email notice very soon if you're interested in. A few remarks about today's event. We hope that this would allow us to try out a few new things. For one, discussing a pre-circulated paper. This maximizes the time for discussion, which we usually find to be the most lively part of our programs. My apologies for a few typos in the pre-circulated paper that were introduced by the OCR software when it was first converted and that I didn't pick up until later. They've been cleaned up on the version that is currently posted. Another thing we thought this would open up is the possibility of discussing biographies of Reich. There have been many of them, of course, and in future programs, comparing their strengths and weaknesses could be a possible topic of interest if we gather that that interest is out there. Dr. Sharaf's biography has been better publicized than most, and thus has been particularly influential. Dr. Brahinsky's paper raises an important point that we at the Trust thought was worthy of discussion. Namely, can a writer convey a mixed message, saying one thing with words, but conveying a contradictory message through the tone, subtle choices of wording? Those who know Reich's work, especially his essay, The Expressive Language of the Living, in character analysis, know that Reich understood that the expression speaks far more truly than the conscious word language. And Brahinsky asks us to consider whether subtle choices of wording convey overall a tone that's denigrating to Reich. When I've heard previous discussions of Dr. Sharaf's book, I've often heard strong differences of opinion, and it won't be surprising if we see that here today as well. Discussion of such differences, I think, can be illuminating, though I would ask that all participants keep their tone respectful and focused on the topic at hand. Dr. Brahinsky's paper can also be a springboard to a larger discussion of how Reich's work is still represented and often misrepresented or misunderstood today. The bio for our speaker was posted with the notice of this talk, so I'll only give a brief recap. Dr. David Brahinsky earned a Ph.D. in philosophy from Binghamton University in 1976 and has taught philosophy and comparative religion for over 40 years at the college level, including the College of New Jersey and most recently at Bucks County Community College in Pennsylvania. He's been a student of Reich's work for over 50 years and is the author of a book titled Reich and Gurdjieff, Sexuality and the Evolution of Consciousness, as well as several articles, including one on Reich and Marcuse in the Annals of the Institute for Ergonomic Science. He'll give us a brief overview of his topic, and then we'll begin open discussion. So, Dr. Brahinsky, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim. First of all, let me just tell you the origin of this paper. This was when Sharaf's book came out, and he was invited up to Organon to speak. Dr. Raphael asked me to write a critique, and I thought I was going to be presenting it at Organon. But after Dr. Raphael read my critique, he had also written a critique, so he decided to incorporate some of the parts of my critique that were not in his, and he did the presentation. So I never presented this paper at Organon. Later, a version of it, apparently an edited version of it, I haven't seen it in a long time, was published in the Journal of Orgonomy. So let me just read some of the sections that I think are most important, and then we can have a discussion about the topic. So the castration or reduction of force of the life and work of Wilhelm Reich, I say, is being accomplished or attempted with the pen. Myron Sharaf's Fear on Earth, billed as the definitive biography of Reich, is the latest and most notable example. He tries to appear liberal. I'm using the word in a way of even-handed or objective regarding Reich's work and his critics, but in the process, I claim, lends credence to the opinions of his critics that objectively or scientifically speaking, as far as I can tell, they do not deserve. So I give some examples. Sharaf says, for example, that a friendly critic would say that the concept of orgone energy and the orgone energy accumulator are prima facie absurd. Although what prima facie means in this context is hard for me to fathom, I don't think one can make a judgment at all regarding the existence and nature of orgone energy or the utility of the accumulator without being thoroughly familiar with Reich's writings and experiments, without some personal experience with orgone energy functions in the ORAC. On page 5, Sharaf states that the psychoanalysts regarded Reich as a psychopath because he advocated adolescent sexuality and broke, quote, all kinds of laws to ensure adolescents would have access to information kept from them by the adult world. On page 31, he says that the analysts believed Reich was insane, but offers no evidence for this belief and gives no rebuttal, leaving only one view as far as I remember. On page 98, he provides Helen Deutsch's analysis of Reich as a, quote, fanatic, without commenting on the possibility that Reich's theory of genitality appeared fanatical to her because of her own armoring. Later, he gives us Rado's opinion of Reich, that he was a psychotic, when Rado's unprofessional conduct, reported by Sharaf, should deny his opinion such easy public access, I believe, or at least make it highly dubious. Sharaf then gives Federn's negative view as well, but offers no basis for it. On page 202, he gives Anna Freud's negative opinion of Reich without suggesting the possibility that it might have been based on her own armoring. And then later he gives the standard criticism of Reich's microscopic work, and then Reich's objections to the criticism. Here, his even-handedness is exemplary, you might think. The only problem is that the uninformed reader has no way to judge between the two. So generally, although Sharaf gives the critic's point of view and then Reich's answer, he fails to distinguish critics who were seriously interested in replicating Reich's work from those whose criticisms can, scientifically speaking, I believe, carry no weight. He mouths Edith Jacobson's opinion that Reich's latest scientific work was, quote, delusional, without stating her qualifications or reasons, as far as I remember. Little by little, therefore, Sharaf accumulates opinions that subtly justify his portrayal of Reich as a neurotic or even a delusional madman. And I can tell you from personal experience with Dr. Raphael, he was very, very strong with me about the whole nature of opinions when it comes to Reich's work. So that's why reading this really stood out to me. On page 281, Sharaf mouths critics who ridicule, not merely criticize, but ridicule Reich for not knowing why orgone energy penetrates metal, for example. On page 401, he lends credence to Eisler's diagnosis of Reich as a neurotic. Eisler never examined Reich, and as Sharaf says, he deceived Reich during the interview, but his diagnosis is taken at face value. I'm skipping down a bunch of paragraphs. So I'm claiming that Sharaf's book is filled with subtle innuendo that functions to insidiously characterize Reich as neurotic or madman. On page 12, for example, he says Reich's work touches us with, quote, peculiar intensity. He could have said intensity or deep intensity or something else, but he chooses the term peculiar. Later, he refers to a statement in Listen, Little Man as an unconventional truth, instead of saying that Reich stated a truth in an unconventional manner. So that's a subtle difference. On page 66, Sharaf, referring to Reich as being outside of the mainstream, calls his outsiderness latent, as if it were a neurotic trait of Reich's and not a result of the wall armored humanity put up against him. When speaking of Reich's desire to obtain credentials, Sharaf says of Reich that he was ambitious for public validation. These remarks add to the image of Reich as a zealot who had a mission. Regarding armor, he says that Reich had a penchant for physical analogies. Later, he says Reich was fascinated by the concrete and tangible, when the fact was, as far as I can tell, that Reich noticed that neuroses are grounded in physical muscular contractions. Instead, Sharaf says that this realm is one of Reich's favorite realms. Sharaf tacitly implies that to see neuroses as rooted in the physical is merely a matter of point of view, of personal idiosyncrasy. At one point, he denies that he wants to reduce his Reich's attraction to Annie, as if she were merely a taboo object, and then proceeds to do just that. He says Reich's relationship with Annie, quote, may have contributed to his sense of conquest, and that he, quote, may very well have had an ambition to win a woman from the upper class. It seems to me that in ascribing to Reich such what appears to be what we might think of as low-level motives, he effectively reduces Reich, although his analysis is pure conjecture and is given, as far as I could tell, without justification. So the above-mentioned remarks of Sharaf contribute to his portrayal of Reich as an ambitious, driven zealot, a man with a powerful sense of mission. He mouths other opinions that Reich was a fanatic, and later says he believes, again we have this opinion, this believes, Reich saw himself as wanting to live a, quote, heroic life. On page 207, he adds to this impression when he says Reich wanted to prove his own concepts. The context is the concept of libido, instead of saying Reich became aware that libido was probably demonstrable. On page 239, Sharaf says that Reich was finally getting to where he had long wanted to be, again making Reich into a zealot rather than a scientist who was following the logic of his discoveries. On page 240, he says Reich probably had a rescue fantasy, although he provides no evidence for this as far as I can remember. Later, he accuses Reich of starting with conclusions or too strongly held hypotheses, and says Reich's critics were right to say so. But Sharaf fails to detail many experiments Reich conducted, which add strength to his hypotheses, particularly of the existence of orgone energy, specifically the photographic plate experiments, X-ray photography of orgone energy, the pendulum experiments, and others. Sharaf thus omits some of the crucial evidence which, when seen together with the results Sharaf does report on there in that part of the book, makes Reich's hypothesis stronger. So Sharaf's caricature of Reich as an arrogant zealot continues when he says that Reich wrote with, quote, supreme self-confidence, even arrogance. In this context, it seems to me that Sharaf is ignoring Reich's continuous references to his own surprise at what he discovered and to his reluctance to believe the revolutionary implications of many of his findings. Sharaf portrays Reich as having a growing fervor regarding the conviction that he was on the verge of discovering a universal energy. He could have said that Reich became excited when he made such and such a discovery. He characterizes Reich as an exorcist fighting the, quote, devil of swallowing the blocked gag reflex on page 312. This feels like he's making Reich into a buffoon there. On 370, he says Reich became preoccupied with the relationship between orgone energy and nuclear energy. He could have reported that Reich began to focus or even focused with great intensity on the relationship, but he chooses to use the term preoccupied. So much of Sharaf's portrayal of Reich turns on such subtle choice of terms. On page 3, for example, he says Reich's life was filled with paradoxes. He then explains what he means by referring to the contrast between the opinions of the, quote, professional community, none of whom were in Reich's profession, orgonomy, and Reich's followers. Does one speak of Einstein's followers or to students of relativity theory? I don't know. I'll let you decide. On page 29, Sharaf says Reich had a passion for priority when he could have said that Reich was concerned lest his discoveries be wrongly attributed, thus distorted. And he makes a number of errors and misinterpretations, as far as I can tell, regarding Reich's work, which, when taken together, add up to a lack of understanding and appreciation, I think, of the discoveries. In the 1920s, for example, Reich was virtually alone, I think, in affirming adolescent sexuality, public availability of contraception, women's rights, the sex-repressive source of the mass psychology of fascism, the existence of a biological core, the concept of work democracy, and so on. Yet Sharaf says Reich was not unique in holding these positions, although he admits he was unique in the way he brought them together. Later, he further disparages Reich's individuality by saying that he was unusual but not unique in working with patients' genital strivings. This statement clearly calls for a reference as to who else was doing so, but Sharaf demurs. On page 87, without citing references, Sharaf says the psychoanalysts were aware of vaginal orgasm and thought of it as a criterion of sexual health. Freud equated the female sexual organ with the clitoris, as far as we know, while late in his career admitting vaginal sensation exists. I do not know how the other analysts felt, but Reich believed they took clitoral orgasm as the criterion of female sexual health. For the sake of accuracy, I would like to know where Sharaf got his information. And as far as I know, and I could be wrong, Reich's research into female sexuality was revolutionary. And also, as far as I know, he was the first to document that females experience orgasm in the same way as males. But Sharaf appears reluctant to admit it, or ignorant of the fact, as far as I could tell. To further undercut Reich's theory, Sharaf says, I believe that Reich was correct when he said that the basis for pleasurable work was a pleasurable sexual life, but that Reich was wrong, excuse me, and that he underestimated people's capacity to use work as an effective way of binding sexual energy in the absence of direct genital gratification. Sharaf makes no attempt to justify his belief. What he does do, Sharaf, is to reduce Reich's theory and resuscitate the concept of sublimation, a concept which Reich argued against, and I think effectively, in the late 1920s. Later, Sharaf equates Reich's concept of a more or less clouding of consciousness at acme, when orgasm is complete, with the, quote, Reichian world of a lapse of consciousness, as if the essence of life can be found in unconsciousness. I think this makes a mockery of Reich's discovery. Another more subtle way that Sharaf undermines Reich's concept of orgastic potency is that he discusses it completely apart from the concept of orgone energy. It is true that the function of the orgasm was discovered prior to the discovery of orgone energy, but it is also true that once orgone energy was discovered, the orgasm became infinitely better understood, as I'm sure everyone knows. Sharaf misrepresents Reich when he says Reich was over-optimistic regarding the value of orgone therapy. Reich knew that therapy could not make a crooked tree straight, as he has said, again, and emphasized prevention through social and educational change. In other words, he emphasized prophylaxis, not cure. Another subtle misinterpretation Sharaf makes is when he characterizes the orgasm formula as a bold leap. If Sharaf intended to picture Reich as a courageous researcher, the bold would have one connotation, but he tends to picture Reich as a fanatic, so the bold connotes something else. But was the orgasm formula a bold leap? Well, a study of Reich's writings, I think, indicates the orgasm formula was Reich's way of organizing into a coherent whole the observations and information that he had at the time. I would characterize it more in terms of a creative synthesis. A more serious misrepresentation occurs when Sharaf discusses the bioelectric experiments, He gives equal weight to Hoffman's and Reich's results, for example, yet points out that Hoffman ignored the pleasure bioelectric expansion relation. Those familiar with the experiment know that to ignore the pleasure bioelectric expansion relation is to ignore the central hypothesis, thus to miss the point. And of course, I would like those of you who know more about that than me to expand on that, or tell me I'm wrong if I was wrong. Sharaf says that orgone was derived from orgasm and organism, but Reich says that he derived the term from his research into the orgasm and the fact that the energy charges organic substances. Now, this is a subtle factual distortion, but it occurs again when Sharaf says that Reich was unable to exclude clearly subjective light impressions from the sapobions. He gives no credence to references on this point. Reich, he gives, no evidence or references on this point. Reich, however, says that he used magnification and sunglasses to test for subjectivity and found that magnification increased the impression while sunglasses diminished them. In other words, he was able to show that impressions were not subjective. He gives the impression, Sharaf, that Reich's desire to control proposed replication experiments regarding the Bion experiments was irrational. It seems to me that Reich simply wanted to make sure the experiments were done correctly, a motive the opposite of irrational. And those unfamiliar with orgone energy functions could easily and inadvertently make errors that could completely destroy the possibility of obtaining positive results. And we should talk about how difficult it is, and it has been, to do those experiments properly, partially based on character. Sharaf, in fact, reveals his attitude towards the Bion experiments when he calls them, quote, the most ludicrous part of his endeavors. Sharaf doesn't make it clear here if he's mouthing the critics or providing his own analysis, as far as I could tell. And then after that, I start talking more about some personal things, which I don't think I have to repeat now. Reich's motives regarding his brother, a photograph of Reich when he had tuberculosis, an interpretation there. Generally, Sharaf pictures Reich as a blind man who acted out of unconscious motives and failed to see the consequences of his actions. And then he kind of sort of psychoanalyzes Reich in a way, explaining particular situations by saying of Reich that Reich characteristically, usually, always, in one case he says Reich always showed a tendency to meet opposition with indignation and belligerence and called him paranoid. Besides having no scientific right to make such a diagnosis, since Sharaf never examined Reich, he never asks if Reich had good reasons to respond indignantly or with belligerence in such and such a situation. He says Reich characteristically overlooked trouble when he preferred not to see it. Then there's a few other things. He pictures Reich as a user of people. He says Reich earned well. I don't know, does it give the indication that he kind of ripped off his patients, but that he didn't actually earn or deserve what he received? You might take it that way, given the rest of what he says. He mouths Fenishow's criticism that Reich abused the transference situation as patients contributed to Reich's work. Sharaf agrees with Fenishow, but he offers no evidence. And then he analyzes Reich's rage as the kind of rage that Reich's father may have expressed. I don't think he can do that with proper evidence. Yeah, that's what he says. He says Reich's outbursts of rage resembled those of his father, which I don't know how we would know that. And then we have the William Washington thing, where William Washington went away with the motor, and he thinks that Reich was paranoid about that. But the problem is, as far as I could tell, that no one knows why Washington suddenly just disappeared with the orgone energy motor. How can you say Reich was wrong? And then he said that Reich fought the FDA the way he did because of guilt feelings. Here, Sharaf sounds to me as if he was completely out of contact with what Reich was being put through at the time. And then at one point he accuses Reich of being a latent homosexual, but offers no evidence whatever for this diagnosis. And I don't think I have to say why that feels like a low blow to anyone who knows Reich's work. So in general, it seems to me as if he wants to portray Reich as sick. He repeats the split personality diagnosis. He again psychoanalyzes Reich's anger. He calls Reich's belief in UFOs and that the Air Force was aware of his work irrational instead of saying, well, Reich could have been wrong. You know, Reich himself admitted he could be wrong. So that's sort of all I would have to say at this point. If anyone wants to ask me questions, that's fine. I mean, I don't have much more to say than what I said in the paper. So I would be happy if we just wanted to have a discussion of the whole issue of the portrayal of Reich. And those of you who know more about it than I do, that's what's going on today, bring it up to date. But however you want to do it, I'm up for it.
Having been teaching under Zoom for the last year, I have become aware that one of the shortcomings is people talking over one another. So if you're not familiar with the hand-raising function, down at the bottom of your screen is something says reactions. And if you click on that, you can electronically raise your hand, which will make it easy for us to sort of see who's waiting in line with a question. You can also raise your hand the old-fashioned way, and if I see you, I'll call on you that way, and I will try as far as I can to call on people in the order in which I see hands raised. Questions or comments are welcome. It's obviously a big realm of material that's been raised. I'll start off with a question that was sent by email ahead of time. A public interest lawyer, James S. Turner, if you're not familiar with his work, wrote a scathing critique of the Food and Drug Administration as a handmaiden of the pharmaceutical industry back in 1970. The book is called The Chemical Feast, and a whole chapter of it is devoted to the legal insufficiency of the case that the FDA brought against Reich. And Turner wrote and said he was deeply chagrined that he couldn't be here today because of a conflicting appointment. I think he was going to get his first vaccine shot. But he sent a number of questions, and I'll throw in the first one because it seems to me like a general question that many people may have. Has your view changed at all in the almost 40 years since you wrote the paper? What, if any, experiences or encounters have you had since 1983 that broadened, deepened, reinforced, or in any other way affected your sense of Sharaf's presentation of Reich that you had when you wrote the paper?
No, I don't think my feelings have changed since then. Current experiences are basically conversations with you, Jim, and with Greer and a few other people, and up at Organon when I was up there a summer ago giving my papers and talking to people and whatever I've read. I did a presentation of a paper that I wrote about Marcuse's approach to Reich at the University of Pennsylvania a few years ago at the Marcuse Society, because Marcuse had treated the concept of orgone energy, the discovery of the orgone, very much the way Sharaf did, the way a lot of people apparently do, without any investigation. That's what Freud did. When Freud was presented with Reich's theories early on, Freud rejected them without investigating. So my feelings haven't changed. Now, if there's been some new developments in this process, I'm happy to hear about it.
Other questions or comments? Are you seeing a hand that I'm not seeing?
I don't.
I believe everyone is able to unmute themselves.
Yeah, okay, so I first see Renee Sandler and then Paul Cohn. Unmute yourself when you're asking your question.
I see Jennifer Evans too.
Okay, she'll be number 3.
and Thomas
Thomas
Riepenhausen.
Riepen.
Renee, can you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question? David, do you have to unmute people?
I believe that they have the ability to do it themselves, but I will. If I find
Renee Sandler says she's not able to.
Okay.
Renee, to save time while he's trying to figure this out, you could type your question into the chat where we could read it.
Wait, I think, where is she?
Let's see if this is a technical issue.
Oh, it keeps jumping. Renee. Okay, I didn't ask to unmute. I can't unmute.
Hi there.
You're unmuted.
Oh, great.
Go ahead.
So I thought it was a very strong paper. I really enjoyed reading it, David. I loved the simplicity of your language. I liked that you didn't use big words. You made it all very clear to us regular folk. What you were critiquing, and I really appreciated the way you did it. The only small issue that I had with your paper is with some of Reich's critics that you quote or that you mention. I had a hard time when you dismiss them as saying this could just be their armoring.
Yeah, well,
Because
I
it
wasn't
doesn't.
saying it, Renee, I wasn't saying it, Renee, hold on a second. I wasn't saying it was. I was saying that Sharaf could have said it might possibly have been. He didn't even consider the possibility. When you know Reich's work and you understand the whole concept of armoring and how difficult it is to understand it, you realize that a lot of us, I mean, we're all armored. And so the way we take Reich's work is going to come from our own armoring. So if I was writing a book on this, on Reich's work, I would always want to consider the possibility that my rejection might be coming from my own fears, my own armoring. And so Sharaf doesn't even consider the possibility. That's all I was trying to say.
No, I understood that. It was just the repetitiveness of that one critique that was the one thing that just kind of just made me wonder the repetitiveness of the one critique. That's all. But otherwise, I thought it was a really strong paper.
Oh, thank you.
Where are we?
Jim, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, yeah, Jim, you're muted. Oh, having trouble finding people here.
You know, David, you could unmute everyone and then people would just have.
You know what? I had the setting backwards. I turned off allow people to unmute themselves. My apologies. Now it should work.
Hopefully now it will be cleared up. Next was Paul Cohn.
Yeah, I just, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I just want to say I really appreciate your paper and your point of view immensely. I think your point is extremely well taken and still very timely. You know, in Sharaf's book himself, he kind of lays out a justification for what he's doing in the beginning of his book, where he talks about in the section, the viewpoint of the observer, where he justifies his presentation of the material. And many of the things that you point out, I think, falls into the category of what he was alluding to. And, you know, he said that at the very end of his section about my relationship with Reich, he says that Reich had given him two pieces of contradictory advice. One was to, you know, not leave himself out, and then also to be a fly on the wall. And so he kind of uses that kind of contradictory bit of information or advice to justify his inserting into his into his presentation, you know, all of the issues that he had and all of his particular points of view and his opinion. And I think that that's a bizarre justification for not allowing oneself to be in the role of a biographer, more clean in the presentation. One does that personally. I think one may do that socially to bring yourself into it and your point of view, but if for the purpose of cleaning oneself. Whereas I think that what you alluded to, or what you're saying in your paper, is that it continued throughout his paper and colored his perspective right through to the very end. So that's what I think is a very fine thing what you've done here, and I appreciate it very much.
Are you going to comment on that, Dr. Brahinsky?
No, I just said thank you.
In response to the point that Renee made, that at times the paper seems somewhat repetitive, tell me if I'm wrong, but I took it to be that you thought any one of these minor choices of wording was not by itself so terribly destructive or harmful. It was the additive effect of them all, page after page after page. I took your argument to be that was creating this
well, that's true.
Overall negative tone.
What Renee was talking about, what Renee was talking about was the repetitiveness of me saying that their rejection could have been due to their own armoring.
Oh, I see.
I did repeat quite a few times because I thought it was possibly true in each of these cases. That's all.
That is a complicated issue, and obviously,
if I was going to publish this, in another context, maybe I would edit it and just have it said once and said it could apply to a bunch of different ones. That might be a good editorial comment there.
It's a difficult issue to deal with because if you understand Reich's work, you know that it's out there as a possible problem, but none of us is ever really in a position as somebody's therapist to be able to say for sure, yes, that's why this person is responding this way.
Exactly.
Nonetheless, to fail to raise it is rather stands out in the context of Reich's work. Jennifer Evans was next, I think.
Yeah, so I was curious, to what extent beyond Sharaf's work do you see both assumptions about, you talked about this idea that Reich was a latent homosexual. I've also heard people just say, Reich is anti-homosexual and therefore none of his views matter. But to what extent do you think assumptions about both Reich's views of women and also homosexuals have prompted kind of a wholesale dismissal of all of his ideas?
Well, the only what I know about Reich's view of women comes from the idea that women and men are no different when it comes to the capacity for orgastic gratification and also the capacity to develop armoring and not be able to become satisfied in life or in sex. As far as I know, he was he saw men and women equally in that respect. As far as homosexuality, I don't know too much about it. I seem to remember it, at least, was it in People in Trouble? Maybe some of you know better, Philip, maybe Jim, you know better. In one of the books where he talks about that homosexuals should not be discriminated against, that he thought that discrimination against homosexuals was wrong. But in terms of his attitude towards homosexuality in general, bioenergetically, I don't really know. And it could be that he was wrong about it, that he didn't understand it, or maybe he was right. I mean, I don't really know. Does anybody else know?
There's only one published passage. Well, he talks about it in a pamphlet called The Sexual Struggle of Youth in 1931 and takes a very straightforward Freudian line about it. But then in a letter to Alfred Kinsey in 1945 or 46, when Kinsey's work on human sexuality is first coming out, Reich says to Kinsey, I find your work on homosexuality very interesting. I think that we still have an awful lot to learn on this topic.
And that was that was one of Reich's most wonderful characteristics. He was always learning, always willing to learn something new and change his theories if the evidence showed it. Let me just say one thing, Jennifer. There's only one thing to me that really, really matters, and Dr. Raphael made this very clear to me, and I bought it when he said it to me. And that is, with Reich's work, the only thing, the central issue is whether or not orgone energy exists. Reich's attitude towards this or that, all that is part of his development, part of his understanding. But what we need to do is prove or disprove, if it turns out to be that, the existence and the functioning of orgone energy. Once we can understand, and if that's ever completely proven by, the scientists in general, that'll be the most important thing, because everything follows from there. That's my opinion. So that was Dr. Raphael's opinion too.
Yes, agreed. Can I just ask really quick to follow up with these assumptions? And speaking about women, I've heard from people who have read Annie Reich's work and know nothing about Wilhelm Reich, and they come with kind of very negative assumptions about Reich's treatment of women, Reich's attitudes towards women. And so just to kind of tack onto that, and I mean, ask two questions, but, to what extent has Annie's work on narcissism influenced or kind of overshadowed interpretations of Wilhelm Reich and his attitude and who he was?
I, for one, don't know anything about it. So maybe somebody else here does.
Anyone?
I know nothing about it.
That sounds like a potential topic for a future Zoom conference, if there are people who want to do that research or try to answer that question. Next in the queue is Thomas Riepenhausen.
Yeah. Hello, good evening. I read with much interest indeed David's texts. I have read Sharaf's book some 30 years ago, so I don't remember in details. The impression the book made on me was very different. It was for me an overview on Wilhelm Reich, much more detailed and with much more information than the former book of David Bordella. But reading your text, I am getting your idea. And indeed, my question, I need a bit more context here. Who was Sharaf? Did he not work with organ energy? Did he not work within the Reichian tradition? Has there been any discussion between you, David, and Sharaf? Where can I find the text of Raphael? So I need more context here a bit. Yeah. I'm not living in the USA, and I'm following the museum only for 2 or 3 years now.
Right. I never did speak to Sharaf since I didn't do the presentation. So I never did speak to him. And all I remember is that he was a patient of Reich's. And I think maybe someone else here knows better that he considered himself a colleague of Reich at some point. I don't know what he got involved in or not. So maybe somebody else here can say.
Well, doesn't he talk about in the book? I mean, his wife Greta Hoff had a relationship with Reich. Sharaf worked for Reich. He was a sort of a star pupil, considered very, very brilliant. Maybe I'll take this moment. I wasn't planning this, but it occurred to me. I have a letter that Myron Sharaf wrote in 1996 when he was 70 years old, a year before he died, to Richard Blasband. And if you want to know a little bit about who he was, I'll read a few passages. He was talking to Blasband about opinions of different schools of therapy and things like that. And he wrote, Kelly has radix, which in my opinion is not an advance on Reich, but a regression, though he had also done good work. Lowen's bioenergy and Pirikos core energy also do not help conceptually, though there are good practical reasons for them. After being involved with trying to understand therapy for 50 years, I could offer a new explanation for Reichian therapy, but it would be nonsense. Reich built a house, and at best, what I am doing is redecorating some of the rooms and adding some new ones. But I would not suggest moving to a new house until a better one comes along, and mine is not it. I hasten to add that I'm not saying a new house cannot be built, but the architect should specify clearly the advantages of his creation before we move there. So I'm finding that in 1996, he was speaking very strongly in defense of Reich in some contexts. And I thought, David, you might like this passage. I had a similar attitude toward Gurdjieff until through Heiko's influence, I got around to actually reading about him, and I found him a thinker of interest and substance. Partly my problem is that my mother had many cosmic ideas, some of which were better than others, but all of which she believed with a certainty that was as great as her ignorance. Reich was so important and is so important because he also had cosmic ideas, but grounded them in a way that generally seemed solid and in touch with reality.
Very nice, very nice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I hope folks are paying attention to the chat. Greer Sellers has put in some information. Sharaf, as a young man, worked with Reich as a translator and an editor. He seems at times to have thought of himself as someone who was going to become the historian of orgonomy. And he seems to think that Reich also thought of him that way, at least at one point, when he was working with Reich as a young man. Greer also points out that Raphael's critique of Sharaf's book was published in the Annals of the Institute for Orgonomic Science, volume 19, about a year and a half ago. There's a published, though shortened version of Brahinsky's paper in the Journal of Orgonomy in 1983, or it could be early 1984. I don't remember precisely. They invited Sharaf to reply, and I think he did publish a brief reply there. Though, if my recollection serves me right, it was rather dismissive of most of the argument. Phil Bennett notified me that he had wanted to make a comment about the book and about David's presentation. I also see a couple of other people in line, so don't forget to raise your hand if you want to get in line.
Is this a good time for me to say that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't want people to get the impression that I'm piling on, but there are very serious problems with Sharaf's book, in addition to the ones that David has pointed out. So I'll simply tell them, and then if people want to know more, I can say, he's a plagiarist. There are whole passages in Sharaf's book which are taken out verbatim from Ilse Ohlendorf's biography and from David Boadella's book. So now that plagiarism could be just due to sloppy scholarship. You take over 10 years of notes, you might not notice that you didn't put the quotation marks there, but it is sad and tragic to see the amount of plagiarism that Sharaf put into his book. Second thing, and David hasn't mentioned this, he attacked Mary Higgins in a way that was truly offensive. And I can point that out if you wish with details. Third, he fabricates. And I'd like to give one particular incident because it's a significant incident. And it has to do with Reich's involvement with a young woman named Lori. And the description of Reich's relationship with this woman is in Passion of Youth. She was a young kindergarten teacher. And Reich had a love affair with her, or she had a love affair with him. And they had no privacy. Vienna was famous for lacking housing. And in fact, one of the major contributions to the Social Democrats in Vienna was housing. In any case, they had to use a private room. They found a room, but it was unheated. This woman, Lori, got ill and died. Her mother got into her head that she died from a botched abortion. Now, how the mother got that idea, God only knows. Maybe because she was aware that her daughter was having a sexual liaison. That's not clear. But I can, if you want, I'd like to look at a passage of Sharaf's book where you can see his treatment of this particular incident. Does it make sense for me to do that?
Yeah, quickly.
I don't know about quickly. Quickly is always a problem here. Okay.
Well, accusing Reich of being involved in a botched abortion is a pretty serious accusation.
Let me just read a section from my book because it's easier. I won't go too far if I'm reading it. Okay. For one thing, Sharaf is always looking for gossip about Reich's personal life. And here's this example. However close Reich may have been to Leah, a different woman, he was also close to other women. One important friendship was a young nursery school teacher, described by those who knew her as soft, pretty, not especially intellectual, and unlikely very much in love with Reich. The girl died suddenly of an illegal abortion. That's a factual statement, not a surmise. Factual statement, the woman, she died from an illegal abortion. And then there's an end note.
You mean that's a factual statement in Sharaf's book?
In his book, yes. In Sharaf's book,
Okay.
He makes that this is a fact that she died from an illegal abortion. And here's his source, his end note. AI, author's interview, with Greta Bibring, May 30th, 1971, and LL, Leah Lasky, August 2nd, 1971. Both interviewees were somewhat vague about the relationship between WR and the teacher, but their stories generally coincide. So first of all, this was in 1971. The event that occurred was 50 years previous, and the two women involved were both in their 70s. Not that that's a problem. I'm 80, and so I don't believe in ageism, but it is worth noting that these were women looking back over a period of time. But note, they were somewhat vague about the relationship. However, that vagueness gets translated by Sharaf as a certainty. Sharaf continues, if Reich was the man involved, and the evidence suggests that he was, the event must have had an enormous impact on him. What does it mean, the man involved? You mean the man who may or may not have impregnated this woman? Because there's no one knows that she was actually pregnant, or the man who committed a botched abortion. And again, what is the evidence? And so this is Sharaf. We know that he felt implicated in his mother's death. That's true. Now his relationship with the nursery school teacher repeated the disastrous consequences of sex outside of marriage, and he was once again deeply involved. Moreover, if his mother's fate helped determine the broad background of his later effort to free genitality, so this experience would seem to have been closely related to his later strong interest in particular sex reform, the legalization of abortion. Now, there is so much in this that is so, it just shows.
Now what? You
Nothing at all?
What? Go ahead.
It certainly
Put my hand
seems
up.
like a house
What
of
did you
cards
do when my
built
hand
on.
So
Someone's,
I don't know.
you ignored it?
can you hold on?
I
No,
can't.
man, I wasn't looking at
Oh,
you.
all right, going like that.
Well, it's too bad.
Not too bad. You now be more aware.
No, I mean, I didn't see it.
Could
She's
people
not gonna let
please
that
mute?
happen again.
Could people please?
Well, I have to stare at you then.
Listen, folks. You have to wait to be called on, or we won't be able to have a discussion that doesn't just immediately generate into people talking over.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry, Jim. I think I muted you by accident. I'm
Now
trying
it says
to.
unmute.
I just was put my hand up.
Up.
Jim, okay.
Yeah, who is saying that they put their hand up? Because I didn't see you and get you in the list.
It's
Ellen,
I see Will and who else?
Ellen Polshuk.
Ellen. Okay, so I got you on the list.
Hand up.
I got you on the list.
may I finish my thought?
Yes. Let me call on people one at a time, please.
Okay. So note vague memories not only stated as a fact that the poor woman had an illegal abortion, but that Reich performed the abortion. There was no evidence at all for any of this. So this is a further example of him looking to find things. But also there's this highly moralistic tone, the reference to, quote, sex outside of marriage. And then he also goes on to psychoanalyze Reich as the reason he had a number of different lovers was that he had to prove his masculinity rather than he had lovers because maybe he had enough love life. You know, it's so, in 2 pages, if you want to really see it, because I'm abbreviating this, look at pages 61 to 63 of Sharaf's book. So the real problem for me is that I learn a lot of important stuff from Sharaf's book. So how can you use a historian, use material while at the same time recognizing just how awful it is at times? And
Yeah.
one example. Thank you for listening. I'm out.
I'm also a historian, and you know the checking on the sources is really quite important. Let me tell you the list of people that I have in line so that you know whether I have or haven't seen you. Raise your hand. I have next Will Freeman, and then Margelina, and then Allison Glick, and then Ellen, and then Song Lee. That's in the order. Oh, and now I see Carolyn Ricketts as well. That's in the order in which I've seen people. So Will Freeman.
Okay. So David, you talked about on page 5, you wrote, Sharaf does not appreciate, accept, or believe that neuroses are in fact or objectively concretely grounded in physical muscular armoring. And then you continue on page 8, add up to a lack of understanding, appreciation of Reich's discovery. And on 14, core anger is real, it makes one feel. Sharaf, it appears, didn't like that. And I would suggest that your statements here and perspectives would not be necessarily shared by those of us who worked with and were trained by Myron Sharaf. I think they are definitely out of bounds for the direct experience for those of us who worked with him. And with that in mind, you have gone on to say, how can Sharaf know what's on Reich's mind? On page 11, Sharaf speculates on Reich's motives. And then you talked in, as you mentioned here, Sharaf pictures Reich as a blind man who acted out of unconscious motives, page 12. And then finally you continue, Sharaf hates Reich and wrote the book to destroy Reich by reducing him
What's wrong?
to the level of a neurotic
I
psychopath.
can't hear.
Say something
I
to me.
can't hear.
Okay. Let's see. You should be able to.
Ellen Bolshek,
Folks,
please mute.
you mute if you're going to have a conversation in the background, please.
I'm trying.
So my question then is, how can you then know what is in Sharaf's mind and speculate about his motives?
Yeah, I think, it sounds to me like your experience of Sharaf was very positive and very different from what I'm getting from the book. And I have no way of arguing with you. It's just as valid, and it's a different point of view. And I'm getting impressions from the book. And so I'm giving my opinions of my impressions from the book. That's all. And
you've also,
one second, William, if you think I'm wrong about it, that's fine. I mean, I'm not going to argue for my opinions, just my impressions.
well, considering that you had no contact with Myron Sharaf or for whatever reason, whether a phone call or discussion, and then go on to suggest that he's severely neurotic and that he hates Reich, I think those are really pretty over-the-top statements for, again, you're suggesting that Sharaf is making diagnoses about Reich, and yet you're making diagnoses here about Sharaf. And I just think that's not consistent with what you've stated in your paper. And you've accused Sharaf of what you have done yourself.
Okay, I take your point.
I hope that's true.
So next in the queue is Margelina. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, it's Mary Elena. Can you hear me?
Maria Elena, okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay, this is a book that have had for years, and every time I've tried to read it, and I kind of felt duty bound to read it, I find it repels me, and I've taken a look at it from different points of view, different chapters, and I always come to the same conclusion: this is a hatchet job, but a very sophisticated one. And I wanted to know if others have thought about what was taking place in the 80s, in the early 80s, that made this book necessary to kind of thwart the interest in Reich's history and Reich's writings, because they were becoming very popular. And suddenly there is this huge, big kind of monument to discredit in a very subtle and unsubtle ways. And I wonder, what was the mood in those early 80s to make this particular book necessary more than any other book? There are other negative books too, but this was maybe that's a giant. So I wonder if anybody has given thought to or actually can recall what they thought at the time, why this book at this time by this publisher. That's it.
You have anything on that, David?
Not me, no. Someone else.
I would just
recall.
say, I know that he worked on this book for a very long time, so I wouldn't consider it a product of that moment. But I don't know anything else to add.
Yeah, it's a book that he was working on for many years, and that only finally came to completion in the early 1980s. I do remember that was a time when there was a much greater public interest in Reich, and when there was even beginning to be some possible interest in the scientific community in looking seriously at Reich's cancer theory. I don't think that got very far, but it was certainly much more well known back then than it is now. So your question may be pointing to something interesting. Alison Glick is the next in line. Is she unmuted? No.
Thank you, David. So I guess I would be interested in just kind of pulling back the camera a bit on this. I've heard several scholars and people who are very knowledgeable about the issue talk about the very problematic aspects of the book, but I've also heard Philip and others say that there were valuable pieces in the book. So given that this is one in what seems like if not a long line, certainly not a short line of pieces of scholarship and publications that are very problematic when it comes to Reich. And I'm thinking of Turner's book as well as others. How would you situate the book, given that it was published in 1983, I believe, in that line of problematic texts or publications about Reich? Is it one that kind of kicked things off, especially, you know, being published a few decades after his death, this tendency to kind of, you know, attack Reich in certain ways using slander and innuendo? Or, you know, is it something else? Where does it fit in the historical context? And how can that instruct future scholars of Reich? Because I think one of the main goals of the trust is to continue Reich's work and to continue research. How can future scholars or current scholars learn from that sort of historical positioning of the book? And the question is open to anyone who can answer it with good evidence, let's say. Thank you.
Yeah, I would think that Philip or Jim or somebody else could answer that better than me.
I could say something about the timing of the book, namely that both the people close to Reich, Ilse Ohlendorf and Peter Reich, had published their books. Ilse's personal biography, Peter's The Book of Dreams. And Sharaf was close to Reich. David, I think if you reread the first two chapters, you'll see, I mean, he worked with Reich, as Jim pointed out. He translated, he worked on the archives. The first edition of Ether Gone Devil was translated by Sharaf, as was portions of the original People in Trouble. So Sharaf was in there. He was very close. And so it's not surprising that these three books come out. However, take the work of someone like Boadella. His book is entirely based on his careful reading of the text. I think it's a better book, frankly, because in Sharaf's book, you get all of the gossip, all of this quote unquote personal stuff that really doesn't enhance the book. You know, and Sharaf has a defense for doing that. He says, well, there's a correlation between character and understanding, so you have to look at the character. But then he looks at gossip. He looks at what this person says of that, and that's why Marlena's point was so well taken. That since Sharaf's book is often sourced as the source about Reich, sadly, rather than reading Reich, people read Sharaf. And that's a real problem. But in any case, when we think about other books about Reich, we are looking at people who did not have the personal contact that Sharaf, Ilse Ohlendorf, and Peter Reich had.
I would just say as a historian that using gossip as a source is not completely off limits. But the question is, if you're a responsible historian, you have to find documented primary source material that actually validates the thing that you were alerted to from some gossip. Otherwise, it's out of bounds for you to report that as anything other than pure gossip. And most historians wouldn't report something that was just pure gossip that they couldn't validate by more objective documents, because it tends to make them seem less serious and like they're gossip mongers. That was something that was a feature of Sharaf's book that was different from Boadella's, certainly, was that he did an awful lot of interviews with people who had known Reich and was very interested in soliciting gossip. Who's next on my list? Ellen Polshek. Sorry that you've been waiting a while. Is your microphone working?
Unmute yourself.
I know she's had some issues with the microphone.
Where are you, Ellen? All right.
Thanks for your patience with the technology, everybody. We're all learning.
I clicked ask to unmute, but she still has not unmuted.
Is she?
I don't believe that Ellen is here. Do you see me? I'm her friend. I'm here.
Yes, I see Ruth.
Yeah, that's me.
Ellen is listed.
Ellen is, I know Ellen very well, and she's not here.
Huh.
Well,
she was here before.
Yeah.
I'll put her at the top of the list if she reappears.
Okay. I came in late.
But at the moment.
Myself. Okay.
Okay. Next on the list is Song Lee.
Thank you. Dr. Brahinsky, I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the paper. I had a very both an emotional and intellectual experience when I read it. I think because it seemed to me so much like Reich's work, in that you were saying you were reading Sharaf's thing, you had a feeling, a hunch, a life response. Like he's saying he's being fair, but it doesn't, there's something amiss. And then you went to his language. I liked how Jim opened with the framing of this as, can our language reveal? Can we be saying one thing out of one side of our mouth, but our language reveals this other part, really, like Reich's claim about the body, like as Martha Graham says, the body doesn't lie. And our words, whether or not he chooses them, I thought your point was not whether or not it was that he is a good person or a bad person, but that whether he's aware of it or not, he seems to be harboring something that skews his view on Reich, and he's not asking that question. And that the essential question at the end of the day is, what is Reich's claims as a scientist? Are they true? Is the claim about life energy true? And for that to get lost amidst all of this other, this and that, and could it be this or is that? And I just, I felt so much as a person who's tried to, for many years, to understand Reich's work and to live it and to feel the life expression, and often running against what seems like expressions of hatred for very meaningful things to me, like a love of children, or wanting to protect their right to sexuality, and having it attacked, and sometimes under the guise of liberal values. I just very, very much felt it as an emotional experience of, I feel glad when someone is willing to step up and say, this actually just seems like someone trying to chop off the life force. And that's what I'm perceiving and feeling. And now I'm going to do an intellectual search to see if I can back that up. And I appreciate that you're willing to say it's your perspective. And I just, I did. And I really have to say that one thing that bothers me as soon as it happens, whoever it's coming from, this like lovers and sex lives, I don't think it should be relevant, because you can't know unless you're in it. Maybe, what if it was an abortion? We don't know anything from that fact. What if he did it? I don't know anything from that fact. On a microcosm level, you don't know anything about a kiss unless you're in the kiss. And I don't want to, I don't want to talk about anyone's love life. I don't know it. And it hurts me that it so often comes to that as a way of striking at people, even when we pretend we're not. So anyway, thank you for the paper.
Thank you.
We have Carolyn Ricketts next, and then Stephen Katz.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, hi everybody. I just wanted to briefly say to Jennifer Evans, I wanted to comment. Are you still, well, okay. Jennifer,
yeah,
I've never read Annie Reich's book, but I've read almost all of Wilhelm Reich's books, and I just love him. And he's just brilliant on so many levels, and he's a humble man as a scientist. And also as a psychotherapist, Jen, I just want to tell you that, I want to say that one of the criteria for narcissism is that the person doesn't care about other people. So I just don't consider Reich narcissistic at all. He cared deeply about people. You can see it from all the work that he did, trying to help people with cancer and sexuality and even nuclear poisoning, towards the end there. So I just encourage you to read all of his books. And I encourage anybody to read all of his books. Thank you.
Thanks. Stephen.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. In 1995, Dr. Sharaf was interviewed by Jim Martin of Outlands. Outlands was a publisher of magazines and books dealing with advanced scientific issues and some paranormal issues. And I think it pays to watch that interview. I think it was about 2 years before he died. There was a body conference in San Francisco. And in that interview, he said some interesting things. One thing that came to mind when I read Dr. Brahinsky's paper is that he said, I really didn't understand the natural scientific work. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it. He said, I was looking for certain things. He said, the social stuff, the therapy, the sociology, that I understood. But he was trying to say that, it was a limitation with me that I didn't understand it all that well. And if you watch the interview, I think it gives you some insight into some of the other stuff. The other thing is, when he was writing, I remember Dr. Baker, who was, I think, considered Reich's premier therapist. I mean, he picked him to train the next generation of orgonomists. He thought very highly of Sharaf. He was up there, and Sharaf was up there. And he said because Sharaf was a patient, he worked with Reich and translated works and so on and so forth, that he had seen him in many different contexts. He had a very good background. Now, what he thought after it was out, I don't know, but he had read it in manuscript when he made those statements. So I read it 30 years ago. I consulted frequently, not for Sharaf's impressions of Reich, but for other observations and what I take to be factual information, because Sharaf was involved in certain events. So I'll go back in the book and I'll see what he says, whether he saw this person up there or, things of that nature, kind of general historical stuff. So anyway, I don't know, it could be on YouTube, the interview, but if you can get a hold of it, I have a copy on video from years ago. I think I made a DVD on it, but it's worth seeing. Of course, he says some of the other stuff that David was pointing out. I mean, he kind of pokes fun at Reich. He makes one statement that Reich was always interested in your criticism of him, how you wanted to kill him and all this, but don't tell him he had a pot belly. Anyway, if you see it, it's interesting. That's all,
So interview with Sharaf by Jim Martin.
Jim Martin, yes. And it's on video, and it was on YouTube. I don't know whether he asked it to be taken down, but you can get a hold of it. And in fact, if I could get my CD, I'll send you a copy of it.
That would be great for our files. David,
Okay.
were you going to respond to that?
No.
Oh.
I will say that
briefly,
in response to your...
I would just say briefly, there's some dispute over whether Wilhelm Reich ever appointed James Baker, not James Baker, Ellsworth,
That's another Baker.
to train the next generation of therapists. But anyway.
Stephen, one of the things I wanted to pick up on from your comment was Sharaf, I think, was being honest to say that he wasn't that well grounded in the science of Reich's work. I mean, he was up at Organon, he was working on translations and things of that sort, but he was certainly no laboratory scientist of any kind. And I thought one of the things that struck me the most forcefully from Brahinsky's paper was this piece about how in his description of where Reich discovers orgone energy, Sharaf borrows a phrase from Baker's book, Man in the Trap, and says, He came up with the term organ because it was derived from orgasm and organism. And that's a mistake in Baker's book. And in my mind was just another example of Sharaf copying from a mistaken secondary source and reprinting the mistake again. I mean, what Reich says in The Cancer Biopathy is it's because the energy was discovered from a long series of research that started with the function of the orgasm, and also because it was capable of charging organic matter.
Yeah.
And in the context of Brahinsky's argument, that sort of means more to me. I mean, like with the business of the visual impressions not being subjective, because Reich had clear, objective ways of trying to test that proposition. If you describe these things about orgone energy in the way Reich described them, it sounds clearer and more concrete and definitely testable. If you describe them in the way that they're described in these passages that David cites from Sharaf's book, they come out, orgone energy sounds like this sort of vague and somewhat subjective thing that very well might be somebody's imagination. To me, that was a really striking example of where the choice of wording made a big difference, that it gave the impression that orgone energy was less concrete and less testable through actual physical measurements than it really was.
I would say that in the course of the interview, he said, look, I could see that Reich was getting what he was pointing out with the radiation reaction in Orinor and, with various things he pointed out. He said, I saw it. I saw what he was saying, but I didn't feel confident in actually being able to really validate it because of whatever the reason was. He did say he personally saw it. It wasn't like a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to just interject. Wilhelm Reich, on November 15th, 1954, and this is probably unpublished, wrote, when the Oriner experiment started in January 5th, 1951, Myron Sharaf lost contact with the work.
Yeah.
In early 52, it was obvious that he could no longer follow. Regrettably, he also developed or revealed under Dor the traits that later on were to influence the situation in 54. When Reich observed...
Where is this coming from, David?
It's coming from an archival document that I just thought is so apropos.
Maybe in the chat you could send people the name of that if they want to look it up.
I don't know if it's published.
But I mean, somebody could certainly make a trip to the archives if they wanted to validate it.
Sure.
I'm just saying, when it's unpublished, we want to help people.
He's basically saying that when Oriner occurred, Sharaf wasn't really able to keep up with it. There are also some comments here about very early on about that Greta Hoff. See, we talk about gossip. I mean, this was an actual triangle. There was, and Sharaf talks about this in the book. I mean, there was an affair between Reich and Sharaf's wife, Greta Hoff, and Reich says when Sharaf and Hoff met at the first Orgonomic Convention, and she married him shortly later. This is Reich talking. In some haste, as I felt it. I also had the impression that she had married him as a kind of Wilhelm Reich substitute, or as a young man, as she probably imagined Wilhelm Reich to have been in his early youth, eager, attractive, brilliant of mind, hardworking, honest. Now, there's a rocky relationship between these people, so I'm not going to say that opinion of Sharaf was Reich's all through their relationship, but that's just a little insight into the beginning of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Song said earlier, the key issue here is, whether or not the public, as a result of this, takes seriously or believes that it's worth investigation, Reich's science. So I'm not so interested necessarily in these kind of personal issues, but Dr. Brahinsky, are you getting fatigued, or are you willing to take one more question or one more comment?
I'm not fatigued.
Okay. Will
Having a
Freeman
good time.
put something in the chat a little while ago that looked interesting. And I said, Will, if we don't run out of time, I'll pitch that in. But why don't you pitch it in yourself?
Sure. Myron was a complicated man, and he was very open about the struggles that he had. And he certainly had demons. And as a patient of Myron's and then future as a trainee, those kinds of issues surfaced. I mean, in the transference and the countertransferential issues. And my only regret is that Myron isn't here, because I think he would be very engaged, perhaps combative at times, and defensive, but also open. And the example that I wanted to share was that, David, you mentioned about Reich's comment about latent homosexuality. I mean, Reich's latent homosexuality as identified by Myron. Myron, in my experience as a gay man, was homophobic. And I remember in one of our sessions how Myron had talked about going down to Provincetown, which, if you don't know what Provincetown is, it's like one of the gay meccas of the world. And Myron talked about feeling uncomfortable, and that it was really difficult in some ways for him to be able to be there. And one of my mentors, she had a gay son, and she confronted Myron about his homophobia. And so I just want to add that to the mix, that both based on my own experience, but also that Myron talked openly about some of the difficulties and the challenges and the viewpoints that he held. And that he, in the eyes of the mother whose son was gay, she felt that by confronting Myron on this, about his homophobia as she perceived it, that there was a shift. And I know that I'm probably one of the only out gay men who was a patient of Myron's. So just to add that to the mix.
Quite interesting. I saw a hand from Judy Rogers. Was that were you raising your hand? Yeah, go ahead.
David, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciated the detailed rebuttal. I remember reading the book when it first came out, and it felt toxic to me. Everything that I've learned about Reich is from his books. And that has had a profound effect on my life. And I'm grateful for that. I get, saddened by the fact that as a culture, we just want the gossip and the juice and the dirt and all of that. But I learned about him from what he wrote. He wrote many books, and I've read most of them. And I'm grateful for that. So I just wanted to say thank you. That's it.
Thank you.
Did we get Ellen Polshek back? She looks like she's still here, but she's not answering.
I can tell you if she's here because I know her.
Well, we see her on the screen.
You see her?
But she's,
wait, where do you see her on the screen?
You have to go to the second screen. There's arrows at the right and left, and she's on the second screen, but her camera's not on, so I'm not sure whether she's hearing us or not.
Okay.
There's another hand from Renee.
Yes, I'm just thinking about what you're sharing, William, about Sharaf. And from what you're sharing, it sounds like he was a complicated person. And I'm thinking to myself, I think, well, is there space for Reich to be a complicated person as well? It's separate from his writing. So I think what I liked about what David wrote is, other people have pointed out, is that the way his writing isn't fitting with what he's saying, that there's a discrepancy going on. And I found that very valuable. And it left me wondering about what happened between Sharaf and Reich. They had a relationship, something happened. And I'm left thinking that maybe Sharaf's work might have been more valuable or more credible had he not tried to base it on his arguments of Reich's work, but rather on his experience of Reich as a person. And I say that because I think when we look up to someone, the big pillars in the fields of psychology, it can be hard to see that some of our, what I call our big daddies had flaws themselves, and we want to get very defensive if they get attacked. And I think Reich was a complicated person, and I think there is room to point out some of Reich's contradictions, some of his flaws. What if he did impregnate a woman? What if he did try and do an abortion? What if that actually happened? Could that be part of Reich's complexities as a person? Can there be room at the table to talk about all of that about Reich as a person? And is there space for that that's separate from his beautiful books? And I'm bringing that up because many, many decades ago, I did an internship at Bruno Bettelheim's school, at the Orthogenic School at the University of Chicago. And his books were so wonderful, and I loved all of his books. But then after he died, it started to come out about some of the darker sides of his personality that a lot of people didn't see or were too scared to talk about. And I think we all have multiple selves. We all have different sides of us. And can there be a space for Sharaf's work of Reich's seen in the light of some of Reich's weaknesses or flaws? Is there space for that to exist?
Yeah, well, obviously it does exist. So he's created that space. I just want to reiterate that to me, anything that takes away, as I said a few minutes ago, from the possibility of the scientific investigation of the existence of orgone energy, to me is not a positive thing at this point. It's irrelevant. To me, it's irrelevant. His personal life is irrelevant to the science of orgonomy. That has to be investigated. That's why I think Jim's book, which was Wilhelm Reich Biologist, for example, I think it's the most important book on Reich since Reich, because it's a book that tries to see Reich, that tries to show Reich in the scientific discussion. That to me is the important thing.
I don't know what to say to a compliment like that. I will say that, and I'll take the editorial prerogative here and make this the last comment, since we're going now an hour and 40 minutes almost. That one of the things that has struck me most coming out of this discussion is the difference between the way that Sharaf can be perceived through in-person contact in Will's experience with him, and the way that he comes across through his book. There seems to me to be a very startling difference between the two. And obviously, I mean, in-person contact, he's conveying more than just what he thinks about Reich. But Will got a very different message from in-person contact about what he thinks about Reich from the message that came across in his book, at least in your argument, David. And I found it fairly persuasive. I also thought when I read the book that it especially tended to make the science sound less concrete and less approachable than it actually was. So to me, that's a very striking phenomenon. And I think that those of us who take Reich's work seriously and read, there are many biographies out there, and it could be that we could actually learn something useful from every one of them, possibly. But I think this is a really interesting discussion in that it makes us more educated readers. It sort of makes us think more as we're going into a book about not just what's being said, but how is it being said? And is the impression that it makes, especially on a larger audience that doesn't know anything about Reich, if this is the first book they come across, is the impression going to be more created by how they say what they say, or by what they believe they're saying? To me, that's a really remarkable thing that we all need to be paying more attention to when we read work about Reich. Of course, reading the primary sources, reading Reich himself, is usually preferable if you're trying to get clear about what Reich actually said. But what will we do in our degenerate times when we all want to turn to secondary sources instead of reading the primary source material? Everybody wants to have an opinion about Darwin, but who has read The Origin of Species? I tell my students it's actually a pretty good book. It's not exactly a page turner, but it's interesting to read. And I would definitely say the same about Reich, even to students who find themselves very skeptical about his scientific work. Okay, David, you look like you have a lot of energy still, but I'm getting tired, so I'm going to declare us finished for the day. I will remind you, especially for those who may have come in late, we have another webinar coming up on Saturday the 27th, just 3 weeks from today. The subject is the mass psychology of fascism, and the speaker, where did I put my notes, is a professor of political science in Mexico City, Professor Jorge Veraza. So please tune back in 3 weeks from today. The email will be going out fairly soon with the information about that talk. Thanks everybody for your contributions. I think it's been a really enlightening discussion.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brahinsky, for your paper.
James?
Yeah.
James, Dan in Hawaii, and this is Dan in Hawaii. I find after meetings like this, if you can leave the Zoom on, there can be some crosstalk, and people can get to know each other and socialize the wisdom and the learning that's available if you're willing.
David, do you want to leave it on for a few minutes?
I'm happy to leave it on.
Probably you should turn off the recording at this point, but you could leave it on.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for intelligent thoughts.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you next time.
Thank you. This is Dan in Hawaii, and I was a close friend of Alexander Lowen's.